So welcome everybody to this first session. And without further ado, I will ask Professor Jessica Gordon-Nembhard to give us her presentation. Thank you very much. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I have to remember it's afternoon for you. Thank you so much. Adote, thank you for having me. Thanks to the ACU for organizing. I also have to say a thanks to Pauline Lewis, who I'm not sure if she's there, but I think she's a member. She's been trying to introduce me to your organization for years. So I want to give her a shout out. I also like to start by bringing our ancestors into the space and acknowledging our ancestors, recognizing the struggles of all those who combat racism and police brutality. Remember the fallen. I want to acknowledge the movement for Black lives. And tell you that I'm here, I stand on the shoulders of those who use solidarity and cooperation to solve problems, to survive, and to thrive. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research I've been doing, I guess it's over 20 years now, about mutuality, cooperation, and solidarity among African Americans. And when I first started studying African American cooperatives and cooperativism, most people told me that that's not something my people practiced. It didn't make any sense to me, so I started studying it more. And by the time I was able to publish Collective Courage about 5 years ago now, I actually realized that mutuality, cooperation, and solidarity are utilized by all populations. We use them on every continent. We use them in every era of human society. We've used them even if we didn't have actual laws for incorporating cooperatives before 1844. We've used, pre-African indigenous groups, early African civilizations have all used it. We sort of talk about the commons, a commonwealth, collectivism. In the US, when we practice our Kwanzaa principles taken from Southern Africa, we talk about collective work and responsibility, as well as collective economics. And so I like to bring that in the room, especially to my US audience, but it might be helpful to you guys too, that it's not something that we just, took from the Europeans. It's something that has been in our heritage and our culture and our practices for centuries and centuries. In the US, a lot of the cooperation and solidarity started with mutual aid. I assume that's pretty much how it has been all over the world. We've also used revolving loan funds, rotating savings, isusus, and we built from those sort of natural, informal collectivisms to actually formal business organization under co-op law, that kind of thing. Why did African Americans in particular, but pretty much, I guess, why would any, especially marginalized group, use cooperatives, cooperation, and solidarity? One of the first things I noticed when I started studying African American co-ops was that marginalization and segregation actually forced us to find alternative economic solutions, right? We were racially discriminated against. When we first were forcibly brought to the US soil, we didn't even own our own bodies, right? Let alone get enough food. We weren't treated as human beings. And so we did things with ourselves, among ourselves, to reaffirm our humanity, to survive, and to create some kind of self-sufficiency, especially across racial bounds. We used African retentions and cultural solidarity to help us gain that sense of collectivism. And then we use that to design and manage the needed goods and services, culturally and racially sensitive approaches, and really to free ourselves. So if you look again at the early mutual aid, often it was to bury our dead properly because we weren't recognized for that, to feed ourselves, and then eventually to free ourselves. Many African Americans actually pooled very scarce resources to buy ourselves out of freedom and then to buy family members out of freedom. We pooled our resources to escape from slavery, from enslavement. We pooled our resources to buy land and equipment. We used solidarity. And then we started our own independent economics that way. So I want to give you some examples of what we've done. First, I guess I have a slide, or I'm not showing you slides. I wanted to talk about some of the accomplishments that mutual aid and cooperativism brought for African Americans, and then I'll give you a few examples. I know I only have about 12 minutes left, so I'll try to go quickly through this. So as I said, using cooperativism has enabled us to pool resources and leverage resources to provide quality goods and services and access, especially access when we've been left out, discriminated against, unfairly oppressed. We've been able to do culturally and geographically sensitive and appropriate goods and services and economic development. We've saved cost, increased income, and even been able to build some wealth using this model. We've been able to literally combat racial discrimination, increase economic stability, self-sufficiency, group independence, and self-determination. We've created decent jobs in our communities through this method. We've developed collective agency, collective action strategies, and leadership, which was one of the things I found very interesting because I'm an economist, so I was really originally looking at sort of market forces and strict economic indicators of how cooperatives have helped. And then I found that leadership development and the social networking were also just as important as the other economic gains. And so the benefits are that these cooperatives and mutual aid have addressed market failure, they address marginalization, they provide joint ownership and democratic participation. They demand and develop education and training among the membership. They affect leadership development. They create meaningful work. They anchor and recirculate resources, do wealth creation, economic and environmental sustainability comes out of this also, and more civic participation. So we know the other thing that I found when I started studying African American cooperatives and the movement was that there were lots of periods in US history where different movements coalesced. The populist movement, labor movements, civil rights movements, all actually also had components that included alternative economics, especially Black leaders. From very early on, the 1880s, we're talking about the importance of economic democracy and economic justice in order to further even the civil rights movement. And so there's lots of these interconnections and sort of cooperative economic visions. I'll leave you with one just to situate you in how some of us have thought about co-ops, and this is from 1933, W.E.B. Du Bois. He said, "We can, by consumers and producers' cooperation, establish a progressively self-supporting economy that will wield the majority of our people into an impregnable economic phalanx." So that notion that we can be self-supporting, most of our people can benefit, and it can be impregnable, right? All things that we haven't had in our economic system. So some examples. In the 1880s, labor, the populist movement, the co-op movement was just starting. They all sort of coalesced together. And labor advocacy was also advocating for worker ownership and consumer production, consumer co-ops. The populist movement was fighting for integration, as well as the rights of farmers and farm workers. And we had some groups, the Knights of Labor, which is actually an integrated Black and white labor organization in the 1880s, which was fairly rare. And then the Colored Farmers National United, oh, I forgot the name, Colored Farmers National Union and Cooperative. And so all those groups were fighting on like 3 or 4 fronts. One of the interesting examples of what they achieved was in 1885 in Richmond, Virginia, sort of the heart of the South. The Knights of Labor, the Black and the white branches, joined together in a campaign to take over the city council because they wanted the rebuilding of the city hall to not be used with convict labor. And they wanted it to be used with integrated labor, cooperative businesses, and women workers as well. And they won control of the city council. They therefore hired racially integrated unionized workforce that included women and cooperatively owned construction companies. And they actually rebuilt City Hall based on that model, and because they did the politics as well as the economics. Fast forward to the Great Depression, 1930s, the Young Negroes Cooperative League started with a call to young Negroes to save the race by embracing economic cooperation, learning all we could about it, and starting cooperatives all throughout the United States. They were founded in 1930 at the height of the Great Depression, talking about a different model, a model that would bring more group prosperity and certainly group control. They had planned to form coalitions of local cooperatives that then built into regional co-op networks and then national co-op networks. They had a plan that if they had 5,000 members that all paid $1 initiation fee, they would have a $5,000 pot of money to use. They mostly were successful with co-op education. They ended up with branches in New York City, Philadelphia, Montesee, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Columbus, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, Phoenix, Arizona, New Orleans, Louisiana, Columbia, South Carolina, Portsmouth, Virginia, Washington, D.C. They had national conferences, and they were able to help local groups start consumer co-ops. They were run, their mission was to empower young people and women. They were run by a woman executive director, Ella Jo Baker, who becomes very famous later in the 50s and 60s. And they were started by a journalist. So that's one example of sort of a national movement. Then an example of a local movement, again, during the Great Depression in Gary, Indiana. Here they started with a study group. The last bank had moved out of their neighborhood. The Great Depression was upon them. They were high unemployment, little access to food or gas or financial services. They started to study cooperation weekly. They formed a course in cooperative education and later did a course on co-op management. They used that education project to help them start 3 different co-ops. First, a grocery store, then a credit union, and then a gas station, and then a second branch of their grocery store. Within a year, their grocery store was considered the largest Black grocery store in the United States in 1936. So height of the Great Depression, they're able to put all this together. They contribute their, at least one of the writers who talked about their project talked about how important their education program was and the role of women, the strong role of women. Fast forwarding to the 1960s and the role of women, the Freedom Quilting Bee started in Alabama. It's a sewing cooperative started by women who were sharecroppers. Hopefully I don't have to explain what sharecroppers are, but it's basically debt peonage for farmers who don't own their own land. They decided that they could sell their quilts to gain extra income for their families, and especially to do quilting in the winters when they weren't farming. They were successful enough that within 5 years, they were able to buy 23 acres of land, build a sewing plant, and move their production from the home to their own factory. Moving production from home to a factory meant they needed childcare, after-school programs, and so they also added that as part of what their co-op offered, so the women could work away from home, doing their sewing, but also take care of their children, make sure their children were cared for. So the co-ops expanded to more services that were needed for the community and for the children. The other piece about this co-op that's so important is that because they were landowners, they now had lots of opportunity to support the rest of the community. So at this period of time in the late 60s, many sharecroppers who were registering to vote for the first time and demonstrating in civil rights activity were being thrown off the land they were sharecropping, evicted. And so the Freedom Quilting Bee was able to loan, rent, or sell some of their acres to these evicted sharecroppers so that they could then own their own land. And so they were helping their neighbors, right, to be landowners, to become free from sharecropping. They were augmenting their own family. They were creating auxiliary programs like childcare. By 1992, they were the largest employer in their town. So they were really a stabilizing force. They brought in all kinds of access to different things. And that economic independence, right, that they had as a co-op meant that their members and they could help their community to be politically active in addition to do more than just survive. So I just also, I think I'm running out of time. I wanted to highlight a couple of youth co-ops that exist now, because I also want to show sort of the possibility of what young people can do and what co-ops do for young people that then sort of spills over into the rest of our society. And we know that having young people involved in co-ops teaches business skills and industry-specific skills. It helps to reinforce their mathematics and writing skills. It develops leadership and mentoring, connections with adults, and intergenerational activity. Most of the student or youth co-ops that I've found for Blacks address community problems, so they're also connected to what the needs are in their communities, and it generates income and savings for them. So one, or actually I said it was contemporary, but actually this one only lasted about 12 years, but Food from the Hood started in 1992 in South Central Los Angeles after all the rebellions about the Rodney King police beating. And the students wanted to do something to help rebuild their neighborhood, their community. And so they started learning about gardening, and they started a school garden. And then they had a summer program about entrepreneurship, and they realized that if they do some value added, they could actually have a business, not just give away their produce or sell it in a farmer's market, but create salad dressing and sell it for a little bit of a markup. So they started a line of salad dressing called Food from the Hood. They organized their business as a cooperative. They voted to save at least 50% of their profits for scholarships for college. And so not only did they grow their own food, sell it in the farmer's market, create a salad dressing, they sold the salad dressing over the new Amazon internet marketplace, and they also sold it around town. They started teaching the middle school kids about cooperatives and about horticulture, so that when they came into the high school, they would have students ready to join the co-op because the seniors would be graduating, so they had a succession plan. Over 10 years, they awarded over $180,000 in college scholarships to their graduating students. And so they now also had real income that the students were creating and a way to go to college. In fact, the college program was so successful in terms of having scholarships that the high school put in a college prep program. So again, you start to see my pattern about how the co-ops don't just help the members, but help the broader community, stabilize things in a community, provide lots of training, economic opportunities, leadership development. The last group I want to talk about does still exist, Toxic Soil Busters. They're in Massachusetts. They were started a youth entrepreneurship program out of a nonprofit called Worcester Roots in Western Massachusetts. They were looking at environmental racism and lead poisoning. Some of their younger siblings were actually getting poisoned by playing in their backyards because many of them lived in brownfields and their backyards were poisoned. They learned how to do lead abatement landscaping, how to take the soil, get soil samples, understand the level of lead in the soil and do lead abatement. They learned promotion and communication strategies as they marketed their business and marketed the issue of lead poisoning. They also branched into video production. And they also were able to create enough money to, buy the equipment they need to sell them, market and sell themselves, and develop leadership development, did better in school, and went on to become leaders in other kinds of opportunities. So to wrap up, the important components that we learned from these examples: having adequate resources and financing, lots of participation, the need for human energy and enthusiasm in all this, as well as to build trust and solidarity, or to build on trust and solidarity that already exists. Ability to deal with conflict transformation, right? How do you deal with disagreements and conflict? How do you deal with transparency, right? To be in a co-op, people need to be able to communicate well with each other, and also need full information about the financial and the business aspects of the co-op. So then you need internal education and training. You also need management training. How do you manage and work with a democratic organization? You also need some public education and ability to communicate with your public and make them understand what the co-op is about and what you're doing. And then local control and intercooperation. I think I want to end by talking about how important 3 elements, that education and training piece, both internal and external, and learning from each other, right? The importance of organizational supports throughout the 300 years or 200 years that I was looking at African American cooperatives. It was very clear that we had more co-ops when we had stronger Black organizations that were deliberately doing co-op development or talking about the strategy of cooperative ownership. So having organizations, strong organizations that deliberately do co-op organization. Community involvement also turns out to be really significant and important. Solidarity with the community, having the community understand the co-op and be involved in the co-op and support the co-op often helped the co-ops in bad times, whether it was bad economic times or bad political times, because often Black co-ops were sabotaged and suffered from white supremacist violence, and having community support made a huge difference, and often was the difference between a co-op surviving or not. And that pooling of resources and then being able to leverage those resources was also very, very significant, and a lesson I think we can learn today. And finally, the role of women's leadership has been very important, and participation of youth. Thank you very much.